And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And Jeremy Scahill, one of the greatest journalists of our time, is on the line with us. RebelReports.com, his new website. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Good to be back with you, Thom.
Great to have you back. And Rebel Reports, this is great. This is a new website you've put up?
Yeah, I work with with a lot of independent media outlets, and decided that I wanted to put a site together where all of my work could be in one place, and also a place where I can do more low-key reporting on a day-to-day basis rather than the longer-form things I generally do for Alternet or The Nation magazine.
Right. Well, you're doing a marvelous job. And I opened the show today with a rather lengthy rant about the revelations that Antonio Taguba made to the Telegraph in the UK yesterday, that the photos that Barack Obama said are not particularly sensational are pictures of men raping boys, men raping women, people being raped with objects like billy clubs and light sticks and wire. And I mean, we know 3 years ago or so that Seymour Hersh said he had actually seen some of these videos, and he said the screams are unbearable to hear. But apparently he was absolutely right.
Right, and the other, in addition to the various weapons and objects that you listed, the one that stood out to me was a truncheon. How medieval have these tactics gotten that are being used on prisoners around the world? And let's remember, and I know you're aware of this, Thom, that it was just a couple weeks ago on May 13th when Obama said, in announcing that he was going to fight and continue to fight the release of these photos, which the ACLU actually won a court battle to get released, Obama said, I want to emphasize that the photos that are requested are, quote, not particularly sensational, especially when compared to the painful images that we remember from Abu Ghraib. Now, you and I, Thom, and I'm sure many of your listeners remember in very explicit detail what we saw in those photos at Abu Ghraib. What they did not depict was rape. They depicted all sorts of torture, piling of prisoners on top of each other, genitals that were being pointed at by prison guards. But we're talking about rape with objects here, and Taguba said that is what is documented in these photos. So at a minimum, President Obama needs to answer to what his definition of particularly sensational, especially when compared to the images at Abu Ghraib, what he actually means by that sentence.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem here, I'll take him at face value that he thought that these kind of images would inflame the world and put our troops at further risk, and I think that it's true, frankly. But I would submit that his belief that somehow he could keep these things secret is naive at the very least.
I wonder what if Pinochet tried to make an argument that his crimes shouldn't be revealed because it would cause a backlash against the Chilean death squads and military.
Well, perhaps a better metaphor would be, what if Pinochet's successor made that argument?
But
to take it to the argument about what if Pinochet made the argument, you're also reporting that to this day, right now, under the Obama administration in Guantanamo Bay, there are basically goon squads operating who your description of them I can only characterize as sadistic, mentally deranged people who are continuing to delight in torturing prisoners. Is that an exaggeration?
No. I also cite the public testimony of some of the men in U.S. uniform who have done the very torture that you're discussing here. Basically, there were 2 tracks of torture that were happening at Guantanamo. On the one hand, you had this very sadistic system of interrogators using a cocktail of psychological and physical torture, oftentimes with the complicity or participation of medical professionals. That is what's getting much of the attention right now. The tactic of waterboarding or this attempt to drown people, that's gotten a lot of public attention. What's gotten almost no attention is that there was a thug squad that was operating at Guantanamo called the Immediate Reaction Force. The prisoners call it the Extreme Repression Force, as do their lawyers. And this was a squad whose job, as best as I can tell, was to create a general climate of terror and strike fear into the heart of any prisoner who would dare to not even mildly resist a prison guard or his incarceration, but to do something like take an extra styrofoam cup from the cafeteria. These teams would be called in, 5 men to a team, dressed in full riot gear. Clive Stafford Smith, the great Guantanamo attorney, said they look like Darth Vader costumes. Each of the 5 men is assigned a different body part. They go in, they douse the men with chemical agents. They're each taking one of their body parts and securing it. They hog-tie them, and I documented that this force has gang-beaten prisoners, put their heads in toilets and repeatedly flushed them, taken the feces of one prisoner and smeared them in the face of another, squeezed their testicles, urinated on their heads, hog-tied them, and left them in a hog-tie position for hours on end. Now, this was the status quo at Guantanamo under the Bush administration. What I've learned is that these forces are not only still operating as they did over the years of Bush being in power, but the kind of torture that I just described is continuing even after Obama's inauguration. And the broader point I would make about this, Tom, and it cuts to something you said earlier, is that to me, this is one of the best arguments for holding those who devised this system and implemented this system accountable for this torture, because if you don't, you send a message, particularly to the men on the ground doing the torture, nothing's going to happen to you because this is going to continue unabated.
Every time Dick Cheney goes on TV and defends this kind of thing, and the Obama administration does not come back and say, that man is a war criminal, that man is justifying war crimes, how dare he speak like that, and instead you get the chattering heads and the nattering nabobs, to use Spiro's phrase, in the media going, well, is it torture or is it not? Or you get Karl Rove saying, well, but it was effective, and that's the only thing that counts. Or Sean Hannity actually is the big booster for it's effective, and therefore the ends justify the means. Even if it were, it wouldn't be justified, although we know now that it wasn't. But what's horrific is that this is continuing under the Obama administration. And I'm curious, Jeremy Scahill, we're talking with Jeremy Scahill, his new website, Rebel Reports, which condenses or contains all of his writing. He also, of course, writes for The Nation and Alternate and many others. You find his articles all over the place, all over the web. One of the great investigative reporters of our day. Jeremy Scahill, you broke this story. As I recall, I read it last week. It's been at least a few days since you broke this story that these that they're still IRFing people, was the phrase, in Guantanamo. That these IRF squads still exist in Guantanamo, and presumably in our other prisons around the world. I would find it hard to believe that they didn't. Has anybody from the Obama administration contacted you? Has anybody said, no, we're going to stop this? Has there been any pushback? Have any members of Congress said, oh my God, we got to hold hearings on this? I mean, what has been the consequence of your reporting this in the press, Amy Goodman reporting it on Democracy Now? I talked about it at the time you wrote about it. Here you are now talking about it. Is anybody paying attention?
No, I mean, what's amazing to me, Tom, is that I'm doing the same kind of reporting with Obama in power that I was doing with Bush in power, but it's not getting that kind of attention. I think a lot of people just don't want to open their eyes to the reality that many of these policies are continuing unabated. I mean, let's look at the fact here. On many of the most premier issues of the so-called war on terror, as Bush and Cheney like to put it, Obama has sided with the policy of that administration against the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, human rights activists, etc. So it's important right now for all of us, independent journalists, human rights activists, and others, to be diligent in holding this administration accountable. This is the future of our country that's at stake. With the exception of you and Amy Goodman, no media outlets have picked up this story. I used to get calls all the time from members of Congress when I was investigating a Republican company, Blackwater, working under a Republican administration, fighting a war that Bush characterized as a crusade.
Right. We should note that you wrote the book, Blackwater, that blew this whole thing open.
Right. I mean, I got more attention off of a story that I did last week for The Nation about KBR electrocuting troops than I did about torture continuing at Guantanamo under Obama, because liberal media outlets still love to talk about KBR and the Cheney connection, and it's an important story. But let's be clear here. We need to stand up for what's happening now to prevent what happened over these past 8 years under the Bush-Cheney administration, and unfortunately continues on with Obama in power.
Yeah, the point that I made in the first hour is that when Lyndon Johnson let Richard Nixon get away with getting the South Vietnamese to refuse to go to the peace talks so that Hubert Humphrey would lose the election, and LBJ called up Everett Dirksen and said this is treason, and then never spoke about it publicly. When Bill Clinton made the decision not to speak about the Iran-Contra crimes and not to continue prosecution of them, when Jerry Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, we have created a terrible precedent of not holding people accountable in this country. And if the Obama administration doesn't hold the Bush administration accountable, there's going to be hell to pay with a future presidency.
And it's going to continue on.
Yeah, absolutely. RebelReports.com. Check it out. A great website. Jeremy Scahill, a great reporter. His book, Blackwater, as well. Jeremy, thank you for being here.
Thanks for the work you do, Thom.
Thank you, sir.